looking into group reincarnation. Joining us are Richard and Tara Sutphen and Don Tinling, who say they were together in a past life over 1,000 years ago. Richard, your story here actually began while you were traveling through Mexico.
Well, this was in 1974, and I visited the archaeological zone of Teotihuacan. And I was very moved by the experience of being in the city. But afterwards, I had a spontaneous psychic experience. It was almost a coma-like trance in which I was back in the city at its zenith, I would imagine, and I was being reprimanded. I was being told to get the books together, and it seems that I had a job to do, and I had not come through. And I had visualizations, very powerful visions of being on top of a pyramid and holding a rod and other things that were quite disturbing.
Your research matched up with what your spontaneous experience was.
And it was the beginning of a lot of study. It was the beginning of my own regressions, because I write books on psychic investigation, and I do conduct a lot of past life regression and seminars, and so I started to look at it myself. Tara regressed me, and what we came up with, it was a very metaphysical society. It was a very peaceful and loving metaphysical society until there was a change and a ruler died.
How do you fit into the story, Tara? You regressed him?
Yes, but a week before I met Richard, I had had a really intense dream, and I was on top of a pyramid, and the people were coming at us, and we were walking back, and we were all male priests, and we were walking backwards up the pyramid, and then a week later I met him. But I didn't probably know that, you know, about this lifetime so much. I had just written it in my journal that night, but my cousin lived with me, and she said I was talking a strange language all night. Kind of kept her up in the next room, and she was like mad at me in the morning. It was a language, not just babbling? It wasn't just babbling? It was a language, sounded like a language? Yeah, I was actually speaking a
Have you been able to verify if that was in any way connected to the language then?
You know, there's not anything in the Mayan or any of those records. Nothing's
We didn't compare this in our first date.
No.
This came out after.
Although that would be a pretty good way to do it.
Later.
I had a dream. I was there.
I was there.
But it certainly, when it did come out, and we had other evidence of other lifetimes, it was part of an overall picture showing a lineage of incarnations.
Now, Don, you have an interesting part in the story to add.
Well, I would say that the regression I experienced with Richard the first time on Teotihuacan was probably, to this day, still one of the most profound experiences I've ever had. Every time I tell the story or I'm asked about it, you know, it's hard for me to believe too, but I know that the experience that I had was so real because it's just something that was so true to my heart. It was, but some of the details of the story I still even question and judge and roll my eyes about, and you know, even for me today, it's hard to accept a lot of the details of it.
To me, the issue here, one issue, is whether this is occurring within the depths of yourself or really as an external experience. But, you know, that's
but does it matter if it's affecting
Well, that's right,
that's
exactly. That's the big question.
The experience that I had was so detailed and so vivid to me, and it's something that I never could have conjured up in my own.
Give us some. Tell us some of the details about what happened.
The first thing I remember experiencing the regression was my body started physically shaking uncontrollably. And I soon realized the reason why this was happening was because, and this is kind of a part that I laugh at myself, it's kind of hard for me to accept intellectually, but my body was experiencing this physical shaking because I was experiencing myself in a spacecraft entering the Earth's atmosphere, and through that experience I was experiencing the shaking.
That we've often seen with the Apollo astronauts is that period where they re-enter the atmosphere.
Right. I was totally in shock after the experience. There were many other circumstances that I experienced in that regression that I shared with Richard right afterwards, and he was a little bit in shock too, because some of the information that I shared with him about just experiencing was some information that he had never shared with anyone else.
This part of it was amazing to me because we talked about rooms and we described them identically and the stained glass insets that were in the rooms, and so all of a sudden I started listening to Don, although I have a hard time with the UFO and the alien part of it. That was very difficult for me to accept. But
although it is all aligned, you know, to planetary, you know, to
and
the
Edgar
sun.
Casey talked about it,
But
and I think that this civilization is an extension of Atlantis, and both Casey and Ruth Montgomery have written about how extraterrestrials seem to have been involved in these societies.
The civilization that we participated in, that we were part of, governed itself from a spiritual place, that the rules of society were governed by spiritual morals, and there was an uprising of people who tried to change that into one of military, of control, of judging other people, of controlling other people's lives. And at first, you know, we kind of laughed it and shrugged it off, and then it got much more serious, and this other section of society started to rise up and become much more powerful, to the point where they started to control us. We had to pretty much go into hiding. We were taken over, and it was a very violent and disruptive occurrance.
There was some imagery that suggested like futuristic weapons. Describe that.
The priests ended up calling a meeting of everyone at one of the Great Pyramids, and only about 1 out of 8 people showed up, but this was a huge gathering, evidently, of about 25,000 people. The priests were on top of the pyramid, and there came a time when a lot of the people who were upset with the priests, who were accepting the new regime, the new dogma, scaled the pyramid. They actually, it was a revolt, it was a rebellion. And it seemed that we could hold a rod, and the rod was crystal, and there seemed to be the ability for those who had trained to do this, to mentally project your thoughts into the rod as a force. It wasn't really a futuristic weapon, it was simply a projection of thought, and the crystal rod was the amplifier.
But futuristic,
and so this seemed to hold them back.
And would hold them back. Futuristic, not even just for that time, but even for our time, more like a sort of a Star Wars type.
Right. It seems to me that it was part of Atlantis, and if Atlantis existed, as many of us feel it did, it was a highly advanced society. And this city, or this civilization, of which very little is known, seems to be an offshoot of that society.
What's amazing for most people to know is whether if they're sitting there watching, is to believe that this same stuff is in all of us. I mean, you know, whatever we make of it, however, whether it comes out or not, all of this stuff is in each one of us. And when we return, you're going to meet a woman who has terrifying memories of being a child running for her life. Stay with us. We're discussing group reincarnation. Joining Don Tinling, Tara, and Richard Sutphen is Helen Fredericks, who vividly remembers a horrifying life in Teotihuacan. Why do you think you experienced a past life in Teotihuacan?
I was a young girl, and I worked for the High Council for all these 3 people here, Richard, Tara, and Don. And at a young age, I took a vow of silence. And so people out in the village and who didn't, except for the High Council, thought I was deaf and could not speak. I developed telepathy to help communicate, but I would go out and get vegetables or herbs that they needed for their different ceremonies. At the time of the uprising that the 7 came in and had a much more violent society, I help them store the pane glass, like crystals. I perceive them more like crystals.
And what happened to you?
So I hid in the tunnels and eventually went out to one of the outer villages and lived. But then they eventually sent, I refer to them as a general for that area, because they ruled with fear and they had to control all the time.
But how does it help you today?
Well, I think it helps me because what I try to do, it makes me, I know in my own life I'm very intolerant of intolerance, of wanting people to all be the same, instead of looking at everyone's own uniqueness and in developing that and just cherishing it, because we're all different and we all have different gifts.
So you go back to this, this regression, and in this very vivid scenario you relive, you almost get reinforced the message about intolerance, which becomes useful to your life today. Do the archaeologists corroborate your memories?
Basically, if I took a lot of the endings that people experienced in this regression, it would seem that about 200 of the priests were buried alive as a way to resolve the problem. The new rulers put them in a pit and then buried them alive. I had no way to verify that, but I included it in the book. And then 2 years, I believe, Earthly Purpose was published by Pocket Books in 1990. It was about 1992 that Arizona State University was doing a dig at Teotihuacan and came up with a mass grave of about 200 people, which would seem to me to verify.
It must be exciting for you to move from the realm of a psychological experience to something.
It was nice verification,
yeah.
But we had a lot of other verifications that seemed to relate to it all. The fact that what people experienced, we would then check and find to be true.
How do you relate to this with the reality of your everyday life now? I mean, you know, you go to parks, you go to movies, you go to McDonald's, you go, you know, you do all the things we do. You shower, you look in the mirror. How do you relate and feel
Don?
about?
I'd love to answer that question, because I think, you know, this is all great, but what good is it unless we can relate it to our lives? And I really understand your question. I know my big lesson in that lifetime was learning how to act according to what I felt was true to me in my heart, to live my life according to what I knew in my heart was right and just, as opposed to living my life according to what other people were telling me my beliefs should be. And I think today in our society we all deal with the same problem. I feel that there are a lot of factions of society that are uprising today that base their beliefs on prejudices, that base their beliefs on judgment, and I think that for us, I know, we all tend to base our belief system on unconditional acceptance of other people.
Don, in other words, these were beliefs you had before, but is this experience just deepen it emotionally, make you more committed?
Right. Coming into contact with this group who I have reincarnated with is a daily reminder for me that I need to live my life according to my own belief systems, not what society tells me I ought to believe.
Spoken like a true parishioner of a church.
My question is about, as far as languages goes, when you're taken back to your regressions and stuff, I don't understand. I mean, if you're actually living inside of this actual reality, wouldn't you be speaking this language? Or when in your dreams, are you speaking English?
Well,
or what
it
are you
happens
speaking?
sometimes, but we are conditioned in this life to speak with the symbol system of the English language. So it's most likely that you're going to do this in regression.
Does it always have to be a traumatic event that brings people back together again?
Good question.
No.
No.
No. I think everyone watching this show is experiencing group reincarnation right now. They are...
Your families.
Sure. Your family, your lovers, your children. No one comes back together, at least my research indicates, and we're talking about 20 years of research, indicates that those people who were really important to you in your present lifetime, chances are you have been with them before. You've come back to learn.
It's almost like the metaphor of close encounters of the third kind. You somehow just sort of gravitate and find each other in mysterious ways.
You set it up to come back so that you have this opportunity to learn. And I think basically that can be summed up as learning to let go of fear. Think of society, Will, if all of a sudden they were to accept the idea of karma. In other words, they're accepting self-responsibility. There's no one to blame. There's no one to blame for anything that's ever happened to you. It's your karma. It's something that you set up to experience as a way of learning.
We'll be right back with more questions from our audience. Stay with us. On our show today, we've learned about two separate groups of people who say they've been reincarnated together. Our panel includes Richard and Tara, Don, Helen, Janet, Roz, Deb, and Michael. Thank you all for being here. If group reincarnation happens, is it possible that, say, victims of a current tragedy, the Holocaust in Germany or Jonestown, that they might in fact be candidates to reincarnate centuries down the line?
That certainly is a possibility. I believe that there's a particular power that happens whenever there is a trauma connected to the end of the life, such as has been discussed with these two experiences. And it may be that the trauma and the power of that emotion connects us more strongly to return together.
Okay, now I believe in reincarnation and everything. I just want to know, in this life, do you guys, do you recognize their characteristics? Or do they behave the same way? Like you said you were working for them, right?
Right. I think that on a subconscious level, you are drawn to each other and that. And I know that when I first started reading Richard's books, I really felt I understood them and that he was communicating to me, which I'm sure everyone does that, you know, when they're reading them. But I think on a subconscious level, you do recognize each other.
Janet, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Do you believe in seances and bringing up the past lives from that?
Through that means?
Through seances.
That's not something that I participate in personally.
Because I've done seances at home, and past lives from my stepfather and my mom have come up.
Is that right?
That's why
You've done
I was wondering.
seances at home?
Yes.
Oh, with the home seance kit? How do you do that? Home seance, you just what? Gather around the kitchen table?
Gather around the kitchen table with the candle in the middle and think about past lives, or think about what happens in your lifetime.
And stuff happens?
And stuff happens.
It does appear that he's reaching an altered state of consciousness as he goes into that. Yes, that's not the way that I work.
Roz, in your paintings, are they all about the American Indian?
No. My latest paintings, I've been doing a lot of angelic pieces, which I've been doing for a long time, but I've also been doing some very dark pieces, which gives a good balance there. And not necessarily dark as in Hollywood type of stuff, but emotional colors. And yes, there is some imagery of skeletal and...
Do you feel more power in certain paintings connected to this reincarnation experience than other paintings?
Absolutely, absolutely. My first, the experience that I had in doing the paintings, before meeting Janet, I was doing some artwork and showing them in Endicott, New York, and Banks, and etc. But ever since I've been connected with Janet, doing my work, that at one time during this Native American we didn't have power. Now I have the power, and I'm having my second show in Soho, New York, coming up next month.
Good for you.
I illustrated the
See,
book.
that goes back to the ongoing question of what good does this do today?
Well,
obviously, it's energized your art.
It has healed me immensely in my work.
I have a hard time swallowing the idea of reincarnation. And the question that I have, and anybody from the panel can answer, is how do you go about validating the experience when a person's in an altered state of consciousness?
Well, you don't have to validate.
You don't have
and with every action, there is a reaction. And one of the strongest feelings that I have about this whole validation thing, because I am the queen of validation, is that we are here and we are trying to bring we are trying to become responsible for our own beings and our own self. And by creating that lifetime, this path that we are on now, and not having to validate that, but accepting and weaving with the flow of energy, you create a harmonious energy, and I think that's what we're all after, and I think that's why we've been brought together. We all have mutual colors. We don't see each other for...
So you know what my bias is on this, is that I believe that the seeking spiritual meaning is the spiritual impulse. The desire to gather is the religious impulse. And I think that, with religion, sometimes to some people I've met who do things like reincarnation or into psychics, it sounds like a dirty word, but it's not a bad word. I think it's an impulse to gather with those with whom you've had this experience. And in many ways, that's what this is. It is a religious experience.
Our experience is very much a spiritual walk, we believe.
Going back to the idea of reincarnation to begin with, to me, it's either a random universe or there's some plan. And if there is some kind of plan, then it would seem that there'd be justice and reasonableness. And religion cannot explain it. No philosophy and no religion.
That's nonsense. Religion can certainly offer an explanation that is just as plausible or implausible as yours is.
Well, show me any religious system that could possibly explain all the inequality and the injustice in the world. Christianity can't.
Yours can?
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
That's
Karma
your interpretation.
Can explain it all.
That, for someone who is a professor and an intellect, that is patent nonsense.
No.
That is
no.
I understand that you're passionately believing that your system is making sense for you, but it is intellectual arrogance to move beyond that, to say that the millions of people immersed in an experience of Judeo-Christian, Islam, Hindu, that doesn't explain their world. You can't defend that.
Yeah, I have a question for Janet. Is there anything else in your current life right now that relates to your past life in Native American?
For me, a lot of the power of this experience was that in my work, I literally kept my work in past life therapy secret for 10 years. I did not advertise it and did not speak about it in public. And what I came to realize was that unconsciously, I was afraid of being attacked again. And it has been with a lot of fear and a lot of trepidation that I begin to step out into the public with this story. And so speaking to the issue of the therapist bringing in one person and another and convincing, I would say that does depend upon the therapist and whether or not they are very, very careful in the way that they present the information, or if they present it at all to a client.
In mental health training, psychiatry, psychology, clinical social work, we are really brought through the paces of understanding the concept of transference, that I don't transfer onto you what's in me.
Right.
And some of the question, I think, that, say, traditional therapists have about these kinds of experiences are the transferences, the influences of the therapist on the client being monitored sufficiently enough.
Yes.
And that's
yes. And I certainly
question.
agree with that. I think it's very valid, and I think it does need to be monitored. And it is important that we pay attention to that and have the understanding of that.
We'll be right back with more.